Welcome to DrJLT Economics. I'm Dr. Juling Tong. In today's podcast, I want to talk about freedom. Freedom is a very, very important concept, although I think in today's political environment, it has been misunderstood, perhaps intentionally, and it has been confused with neoliberalism or even liberalism, which, by the way, I think there are very few traditional liberals left. I think as neoliberalism takes hold, what we can observe is a sad fact, which is that a neoliberal society has turned out to be not so liberal after all. And freedom in its true sense is really being dismissed. People are being called names because they love freedom, because they think freedom is more important than some ideals that is really not so tangible, some ideas that is based on ideology. What I mean really is that freedom is about a society that welcomes a diversity in thought, but not necessarily a society where the thought is imposed on people to accept diversity in some undefined measures. So having this in mind, I wrote yesterday a blog post, and this podcast will be my comments on this blog post. I think this is a very, very important one, especially today, by the end of 2021, where we see that the Western liberal democracies are abandoning freedom in pursuit of a new liberal or perhaps new conservative, very little difference between them, goal of hegemony, an ideology centered around issues such as wokeism, issues such as global warming. I'm not denying that the climate may be changing or that there is no racial issues racial or gender issues in these societies. On the contrary, they exist and they need to be dealt with, but they should not be dealt with an ideology that takes freedom away from people. In other words, people should be free to think and say, to think in whatever they want to think, and they should be free to express their opinions. If their opinions are abhorrent to you, well, they are still nevertheless entitled to their opinions. You should not silence them. And of course, if people take action, try to commit crimes, then there needs to be strict adherence to the rule of law. And people who are going to commit crimes, whatever, because of racial hatred or gender misogyny or whatever, they need to be punished, and they are being punished. But thought, ideas should not be censored. Of course, in the beginning, what is being censored is our abhorrent ideas. But as those in power, those in control of the censorship, get addicted to the power that this ability, this control wills, they will then control the speech. They will then control the ideas in order to drive their own personal interests. And in this scenario, the culture of a society will degrade, will degenerate. And the economy of a society cannot function well. Very interesting, a very simple example is, let me give one about the economics. And the one word that I want to talk about is transitory. I think I have talked about the word transitory in one of my earlier podcasts from, I think, around the summertime. It was quite simple, right? Jerome Powell suggests that transitory is a word that entails something that does not take a lot of time because it's only a period of transition. But we know, just take an example of, let's say, a country's transition from a feudal society to an industrialized liberal democracy. How long is that transition? The transition can take a century. So transitory only means that inflation is transitioning from low inflation to high inflation, nothing else. And yet it has been hinted, and the word has been used intentionally to mislead the public into thinking that inflation is transient, which really is the appropriate word if you want to suggest that the period of inflation of relatively high, above average inflation is short. If it's just a transition, well, it can take a long time. And during this period of transition, things can become volatile, unpredictable. And this seems to be exactly what we are observing. Moving on to this blog post, I think what really inspired me to write it is some of the current events. And one thing that I noticed just this weekend was that in, I think, March 2020, it was Reuters who published an article basically fact-checking some conspiracy theories that suggest that Australia, the country has been named Australia, was going to impose some legal requirement for certain medical procedures, and that it was going to build some sort of camps to confine people who are not compliant, who do not accept these medical procedures. Now, of course, one would, in 2020, not find it too difficult to accept that these were really out of this world conspiracy theories. How could it be? Right? Even I wouldn't think Joseph Stalin would have done that. But hey, Australia was a democracy. They love freedom. That is a load of BS. Australia is a country that, when democracy was convenient, wanted to boast its democratic values. But when some part of the population do not want to comply, then you show them the camps. In other words, democracy when convenient, authoritarianism when necessary. And this is something that I think many would consider what Joseph Stalin would have said. And I think this is exactly what the Australian government, the Australian officials are doing. And similar things are being proposed across many Western so-called liberal democracies. And this really highlights the fact that freedom is really fragile. You cannot expect those in power whose interests contradict you, or may contradict you, to always uphold your freedom when there is no strong institution to protect you. Because when your interests, the interest of freedom, contradict with their interest, whatever that may be, your freedom may be taken away. And so that is really an observation that really makes me think about this issue in more depth. And of course, we also see a couple of great geopolitical struggles. One centered around the Taiwan Strait, another one around eastern Ukraine. These are all historically problematic regions. Taiwan, because it is an unfinished civil war, I think from 1949, 1950. And in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, that was the result of the partition of the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And of course, because Ukraine being a single country, a single nation, but composed of two major groups, perhaps even three major groups, who don't always share the same views. And sometimes some groups have some quite militant views of the other groups. These are regions that inherently aren't very stable. But we can also see that in the last year, maybe 2 years, things have really shifted into a higher gear, as I think mostly US foreign policy have pushed these regions into flashpoints. And as a result, what we can see is that freedom in these regions are also waning. In China, I think we can observe perhaps with the reasoning, not dissimilar to that found in the West, the reasoning of combating some type of disease or medical issues, that there's been a tightening of certain controls and more requirements to carry certain verifications. And these things are not conducive to building freedom. At the same time, China is really closing its borders, making it very difficult to travel to and from the country. And it's extolling some Confucius values, which I don't think is really what made China great historically. If we look at the Tang Dynasty, the Han Dynasty, these were the Song Dynasty even. Those were the heights of Chinese prosperity. And in these times, it was not because China was less free that China was better or China was great. China was great because it was more free. It was because Europe in those times fell into the Dark Ages. It was in the middle of the Dark Ages. The Roman Empire fell after around the Han Dynasty, right? It was in that context that China became a great nation in history. But as China became more inward-looking, as China became more less free, and in fact, as the Chinese nation was conquered by a foreign race, namely during the Qing dynasty, China became less free and increasingly less prosperous, which was one of the, actually it was the reason, not one of the reasons, it was just the reason why China became a backward country. And I have this fear, or perhaps not necessarily fear, but I have this concern that the Chinese government may be moving in the same direction, and that obviously is not good in a historical perspective. And of course, we can't stop there without talking about the United States. The United States, what is it doing? It is clamping down on one of the most important founding principles of the country, which is the freedom of speech. And this new Twitter CEO came out and said that they are not bound by the First Amendment. So basically, what this guy, the head of one of America's big tech companies, come out and said that we give the middle finger to the Constitution of the United States. That's what he says. And this is being cheered on by some of American citizens and residents who hate the principle of America. They love the empire. They hate the principle of America. And in this context, there are some points that I make in this blog post. One point that I make, I think many of you who listen to this podcast will agree, which is that freedom really correlates with confidence. A society that is confident of its own virtues is a society that is free. It's a society that is tolerant. Whereas a society that is insecure, that is unconfident, will see freedoms in various domains recede. And freedoms will be taken away by those in power because they fear that a free-thinking people may one day threaten their position. This is certainly not... I think we don't need a lot of examples I don't think we need to go too deep into the examples because, hey, just look around, right? Dictators, autocrats, they fear about their position. They don't want people to freely communicate among themselves of ideas. You see, when they control ideas, perhaps mostly to control the political life. But a consequence of that is that the control also extends to the social life, the cultural life, the economic lives. when people cannot communicate freely, they cannot exchange ideas freely, scientific discoveries cannot be made as well, and arts, culture just simply cannot progress as well. An example that I didn't put in the blog post perhaps is one about the Japanese semiconductor industry. Japan, there was a period of time when Japan was the leading player in semiconductors. It was a very short period of time. And the Japanese achieved it by having this, let's say this organization. It was a government-sponsored organization where some of the top companies sent their top researchers to form a project team together under the supervision of a guy that is from this government entity. And they made collaborative efforts. They exchanged ideas. They broke the walls among them. Even though they are all competitors, they broke the walls among them and they exchanged ideas. They collaborated. The result was that they became very successful. But after this period ended, the walls were erected again and they fell behind. By contrast, there were some European researchers, European countries who are much behind, and they had a more open culture in scientific research, and which was why they now have this ASML, while Nikon and Canon fell behind in their lithography machines, semiconductor issues. So this is a lesson. Well, I guess this is something that we need to really keep in mind, right? Confidence gives freedom, but freedom awards you with progress that can boost your confidence. This is a positive feedback loop. The converse is also true. When you have low confidence, when you're insecure, you take away people's freedom, then the cultural, social, and economic situation worsens. Thus, the political situation worsens. The country becomes unstable, and you become more insecure. That's this point. The next point I made with quite some paragraph was that freedom, liberty, is what made America great. And of course, this is not to say that America was always very, very free for everyone. It was never wholly free, right? As I said in this blog post, to this day, I just realized the typo there. But America bears the scars of genocide, slavery, racism, and imperialism. But what they had was an idea, and it marketed it really exceptionally well. Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, just a few short years ago, a Republican congressman said that the United States is exceptional in that it is the only country in this world founded not by not by blood, I think, that's probably the words that he used, but on an idea. Well, I don't necessarily think that we can say so we can say so highly of the United States. I'm not entirely certain that the republic was founded on an idea, and I certainly am not sure that it is the only nation that's so founded. But it is certainly true that for a long time, freedom has been enshrined in the founding documents of that country, way before it has been in other republics, in other nations. In fact, it is also one of the first republics, which by itself is something, because at the time it was founded, most countries in this world were not republics. So that was the situation. Now, the point that I made, particularly in this section, was that it was because there was freedom. It was because America had the rule of law, and this followed, I think, a principle of the British common law. I think there is one expression which was that whoever you are, the law is above you. Actually, I think that's not exactly what he said. There was I think probably however tall you stand, the law is above you, or something like that. And this was, I think, in relation to a story of a king of England, or maybe it was his brother, I'm not entirely certain now, that committed a crime, and the court sentenced him to certain whatever, judged on him. And this was basically a precedent, and this was also the tradition in the common law system, which is that no one stands above the law. And with freedom and the rule of law, the system that is simple and efficient can be set up that promotes economic progress, that promotes cultural progress, that promotes social progress. Of course, America was never, as I said, never perfect. It was never perfectly free. It was not wholly free, but it had always been, until recently, making progress towards a freer society. And this much cannot be said about a lot of countries. Take again the example of China. It was a very, very free society in the Tang Dynasty. Then they regressed, and it became better again a bit later, and then it regressed again. So the history of a nation is not always that of a progression, and efforts must be made to ensure that we have the institutions that promotes freedom, ever greater freedom, so that all these benefits, social, political, economic, and cultural, can be reaped. But a really ironic situation, again, that I observed in this blog, is that there are many Chinese officials who went to study in the United States. But when they went, it was after Nixon. It was after Nixon decoupled the US dollar and violated the Constitution. I don't quite remember, is it Article 10 or what? I think there was an article, a paragraph in the Constitution that explicitly states that no state should should coin any money other than gold and silver or something like that. I'm sorry, I don't really remember the exact wording, but only gold and silver are money. Everything else is unconstitutional. But hey, Nixon violated it and debased the US dollar, and in the process reneged on its obligations with regards to Britain, and of course later Gordon Brown, who in this regard could be considered one who sold out the country, because his government sold the last bits of Britain's gold reserve at the lowest point in 2 decades. It was really an interesting thing. After he finished, a gold price shot up, and that was the end of the greatness of Britain, at least in monetary terms. And of course, when the Chinese went, it was after Carter betrayed his constituency and gutted the labor unions. He betrayed labor. And it was after Jimmy Carter, it was actually since Jimmy Carter, that the Democratic Party in the United States no longer represented the labor movement. It no longer represented the working class. It still inherits the language of that tradition, but it now represents the moneyed class, the big tech executives, the Silicon Valley, the Hollywood, right? It no longer represents people in the middle of the country. And that's what the Chinese learned, all right? And of course, it was after Reagan started the trickle-down voodoo economics, which basically says that let's print some money, print a bunch of money, give it to the rich, and they will make the economy more, they will make the country more prosperous, and everyone will be better off. This has, the last bit has not been observed. And of course, it was also after Clinton deregulated the media. And that was when a lot of the traditional news platforms began to shift to opinion platforms. No longer publishing news articles, no longer reporting on the news, but instead injecting their opinions into every event and selectively ignoring events that are inconvenient to their worldview. So in essence, what the Chinese did not learn what made America great. They learned what made America weaker. And this can be summed up as money printing, stimulus. This is a ridiculous idea. How can you stimulate in an economy? When an economy, the only time when money printing by the government can work is when there is an overabundance of overproduction, but not enough demand. That was the only situation. But when there is when there is an undersupply, when there is already inflation, or when there is the economy is half dead, when there is when everything needs to be imported because demand demand much higher than the supply, printing money is not going to make the situation any better. It's going to make it worse. And of course, China, taking the advice, or maybe not necessarily the advice, but taking the lesson from Carter and Reagan, dismantled its public healthcare system, made education an expensive experience, and of course make housing literally unaffordable. This is a very, very bad situation. And they think that they learned free market economy. No, that's not free market economy. That's crooked. That is crooked economy. A free market economy was more akin to the economic system that the United States had in the 1890s or the early 1900s. Of course, it was not perfect. I'm not saying that every country should copy that system, but just know that the current system of government intervention of reckless monetary policy, of irresponsible fiscal policy, of excessive deficit, and a policy of that favors big government, big corporations, and burdens small and medium-sized businesses with regulations that are completely dumbfounded, just completely irrational, is a recipe to destroy the country, the economy. And finally, I also make the final observation, and this is my belief. I think it will pan out this way, which is that in the coming years, we cannot rule out some sort of military conflict. But even if the war remains cold, there is a great geopolitical struggle. And in this great geopolitical struggle, I believe the party that will win is one that will be more free. Currently, every side, whether it's Europe or it is Russia or China or the United States, they are, and indeed India, they are all trying to be less free. They're competing on who can take more freedom away from their people. But I think this will change for two very simple reasons, right? One is that, as I discussed really in length in this podcast, that freedom is what underpins economic and cultural prosperity. Right? No single person or any machine is wise enough or long-living enough to plan everything for everyone. The Soviets tried, and the Chinese tried. And of course, the Koreans are still trying. I mean, the North Koreans. They're not very successful in planning everything for everyone. We need a free society where the wisdom of every single person can be leveraged. And we need to devise an institution that makes this, that directs this, the wisdom of all the people, all the citizens, to create positive force for economic, social, cultural, and political development. We need to build institutions, not internment camps like those stupid people down under try to do. And the second point is that freedom is an ideal that everyone across the world look up to. There are some people who are very arrogant, perhaps racist. I don't know that for sure, but arrogant, absolutely. They think that people look up to the West because of their cultural superiority, maybe racial, genetic, who knows. But the fact is that I believe that a lot of people from more backward countries, economic and socially backward countries, look up to these places because in the last few decades, in other words, in the last 2 generations, these Western liberal democracies have been relatively more free. And people really look up to freedom. They do not really care whether you speak certain language, or if you are if you're a certain color, or if none of that. Maybe part of a good understanding of your historic heritage, perhaps, but beware, a lot of those currently backward countries, culturally, socially backward countries, had glorious histories, longer than yours and more glorious than yours. What's really interesting, what really attracts them is freedom. Take away freedom, you will see that EU is no better. Take away freedom in the EU, you will see that it is just a backwater, perhaps at most, we can think of it as Holy Roman Empire, but perhaps at worst, it's just some kingdom in the edges of civilization, the far edges of the continent. And the same applies to China. China, there are some people, perhaps, in China who think that China is currently in this great dynasty. And they wonder why, that despite their economic success so far, they haven't been able to really attract a lot of the admirations that they think people from relatively backward countries, or the third world, let's say, or developing countries, look up to. And why don't they? Why China is not enjoying the respect from a lot of the citizens from the West? The reason is very simple. Because rightly or wrongly, China is perceived as a country that is not free. China is a place perhaps that people work very hard, they produce some goods, all right, let's do a business, that kind of place. But it is not a place where people aspire to, people look up to. It's not a place where the best talents want to go, and it's not a place where people want to do deals with simply because it is a place that they love. They can do a deal when it's convenient, when it's cheap, but not when it doesn't have these numerical advantages. So the question is, which power will be the one that is the most free? I cannot make I don't want to make a prediction here. I'm not very optimistic in any of these aforementioned places. And I think it really takes some, we will see. It really takes strong institutions for this to happen. And unfortunately, in the United States and as well as Europe, we are seeing consistent efforts by some people in power to undermine the institutions, to destroy the institutions that underpin freedom. and in countries like China and Russia, I fail to observe strong efforts to build these institutions. And just as the word transitory, I think we are in a transitional period. And if we are lucky, our generation will see the end of it. We will see it to the end of this great geopolitical struggle. And we will see which part is more free and which part of the world will become at least culturally and socially dominant. It's very difficult to make a decision, to make a prediction now, but what I can say is that I hope that it will happen within our lifetimes. But transitory means something can take a long, long time. And just as one of the previous transitions, or several, let's just give a couple of examples. The fall of Rome, the Roman Empire, the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and of course the fall of the Qing dynasty. None of them to happen in a single century. They all took several centuries. So we don't know. Perhaps this transitory period is longer than our lives. But nevertheless, I predict that it is freedom that will eventually win. Thank you for listening to this podcast. And of course, if you are watching this video, I welcome you to my website, DrJLT.com, and you can read my blog post, and there are some other contents there as well. Thanks for listening and have a great day.